Thank you so much, Brad, for agreeing to talk to me. Funny story how we met, and I'll just run through that. I saw one of your articles on your blog, which I'll link in the description, shared on Twitter or Facebook, and then I read it, and then I found you on Twitter, and then I messaged you telling you how much I liked it, and now we have a pretty cool rapport. So I'm really excited to talk to you about product management. Brad is a product manager at Facebook. So yeah, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you for having me. We've talked a few times off the record, so it's nice to talk on camera, which is cool. So thanks. This is cool. Quick bit about me. My name's Brad. I'm a product manager. I've been doing product management for about 15, 16 years now. I work at Facebook on charitable giving tools, which is how we help fundraise and raise money for nonprofits and people. Before that, I was at Oculus doing a bunch of VR stuff. And I worked at a bunch of startups in New York City, one of which was called Shapeways, which is a 3D printing marketplace. So I've done hardware, cutting edge, very traditional work, kind of everything in between. And before that, I was a pro gamer playing Quake 3 and Halo and Call of Duty. So a bit of a non-traditional PM background.
I think the PM stuff's more interesting, but I think some people will think the pro gaming stuff's more interesting. How do you define, what do you define in the industry as professional gamer, like someone that's getting paid to compete?
Yeah, I dropped out of college to compete. I had a team. We would get flown around to different tournaments. We had a sponsor who would buy our hardware and things like that. It was before Twitch, so I don't think we made that much money. I made enough money to cover rent in a 2-bedroom apartment in rural Indiana. But it was awesome. It was fun. I met so many great people that I still keep in touch with. So that was a really, really cool experience.
That's awesome. I haven't met anyone that has done that before. Well, cool. Yeah, let's dive into the product management stuff. I get this weird, I don't want to say stigma, but I get this vibe that when I tell people, oh, I'm interested in product management or learning more about the space, even from technical people, you get I don't even get what product managers do. And I think it changes the company. So in summation, in your experience, how would you describe what product managers do?
Man, I actually prepared for this question, and I still don't feel like I have a great answer. So I'm just going to say kind of what comes to mind. I think that a product manager's role definitely changes depending on the stage of the company and the product. But my belief is that product managers have to know or understand their customer better than anyone else in the company. They need to understand the needs of those people. So they need to be able to name them, describe who they are, understand their needs and their problems, and then find the right solution that solves those problems for them. And I think that the place where people get confused is they assume that means the product manager has to be like Steve Jobs and have the ideas and be like the idea person in the room. And I actually don't think that's true. I think the product manager's job is to find and source the best ideas and the best information within the company or outside of the company, to bring it to the table and then build a framework or a structure that the team can use to make decisions. And I think that last part is actually the hardest part of being a PM. If you think about someone who's going bowling, when they step up to the line, they're likely, especially their first time, going to toss a ball in the gutter. If they're lucky, maybe they hit a pin. And so the way I view my job is I don't want to be making all the decisions. I want all the engineers on my team to be able to make great decisions, the designers, et cetera. And I'm going to give them a framework and a structure to where they have a high likelihood of bowling a strike. So that could be describing a success metric, like what's the metric we're trying to hit. It could be laying out the specific customers we're building for and then arranging interviews so people can meet those customers and hear directly from them. Or it could be writing a strategy that says, first we're going to do X, then we're going to do Y, then we're going to do Z. And so those all to me are within the realm of product management. And the last thing I would add is I don't think that a PM has to do all of those things. On teams that I've worked on, sometimes I'm the strategy guy. Sometimes I'm the execution and roadmap guy. Sometimes I'm the go find a bunch of customers and talk to them and bring them back to the team. So I don't think it's a very defined, rigid role. To me, it's very fluid, and I flex based on what the dynamics of the people on the team are and what we need.
That was amazing. That was really good. I have a lot of questions that come out of that. First one being, what is the commonality? Because you said there's sometimes you're the strategy guy, sometimes you're the customer guy, sometimes you're a different person. is there a commonality in, regardless of the role you're assuming, that you have or a PM should have that is consistent across the board?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that momentum is the answer. The PM is responsible for maintaining momentum. And I may be using the wrong word there, maybe it's velocity, but it's something like the team needs to keep moving and not get stuck. So that's responsibility number one, meaning if an engineer is blocked because they don't know an answer to a question, if there's a biz dev deal we need to cut, if there's a customer we need to talk to, like I will go make that happen or find the person to make it happen so that the team keeps moving forward. And then I also make sure that the team moves forward in the correct direction. So those are, to me, are the kind of like two ultimate responsibilities that I have as a PM. And if you said like on any team I'd be on, I'm always unblocking people and making sure they can move forward, they're not stuck. And I'm always trying to make sure we are headed in the right direction, or at least we have a sense of how to get there.
That's really interesting. Do you find, because it sounds like, and from my experience, product managers have to have a lot of empathy, right? Empathy for designers, empathy for engineers, empathy for the customer. Is it possible to be a product manager in an industry or a company that you have little to no interest or passion in? Or is that really difficult? Because like there are these frameworks that you can build across the task of and job of being a product manager, but then there's the like and being empathetic with your customers and knowing what they want and how to deliver that. Or do you find that it's actually more beneficial to not have skin in the game because you can take a step away? You see what I'm saying?
I think it depends on the person. Like one myth I want to debunk is you definitely don't have to be a subject matter expert.
Okay.
Most of the areas I've worked in, I definitely don't know the industry. But when I started working in VR, like I didn't know anything about it. I ran a 3D rendering team, and I am not technical whatsoever in that aspect. So I don't think you need to know. I do think that some level of passion has to be there, because to do the job well, you just have to talk to a bunch of people, whether they be industry experts, people on your team, externally. And if you get bored after 6 hours of talking about a subject, well, you're going to be talking about the subject like every single day of your life when you're at work for the next 4 to 6 years. And so I do think that you need some excitement or passion or enthusiasm. Having said that, like I definitely know people who are great PMs that just bounce from project to project, almost like mercenaries, and they just do the work. So I think it is possible, but from my perspective, from my personal process, I have to be passionate and excited about a space, especially like the mission of what we're doing has to align with my core value as a human.
Okay. That's really interesting. It seems like, the reason I asked that, it seems like from a personal perspective, if you're super passionate about, I don't know, you're a software engineer and you're passionate about developer tools, or you're passionate about open source, and then you become a PM on a project that does that, that your judgment gets clouded on what you want versus providing like a roadmap for the customer.
I think that it can be. I mean, some of the best PMs I know just are out there solving their own problems. And so I do think, especially in the developer tools space, a lot of the developer tools that pop out because either an engineer or a PM had a problem, they want to solve it and they want to scratch their own itch. I do think that there is a chance that you can get too wedded to your own solutions. And I do think that's a danger. For me, I think, and I understand where you're going with the empathy piece now, I do think it's really important. One of the things that when I interview someone at all the companies I've been at that I look for is, can someone take themselves out of their own shoes? So if I'm interviewing you, for example, and you said, like this is where I live, I have this problem every day, I'm going to walk through and build a product that solves this problem. I will challenge you to try to describe to me an audience that is nothing like you. Talk to me as someone totally across the world who has nothing in common with you. Can you put yourselves in their shoes? Can you deeply understand what makes them tick, what their problems are, what they care about? Because I do think that no matter which field you're in, you do have to be able to do that as a product manager.
That's awesome. So we talked about velocity and in momentum, and I kind of think that might be where you're going with it. But if you were to describe what's the difference between a good product manager and a great product manager?
I think that a good product manager gets shit done. And I think that a great product manager knows when they're headed in the wrong direction. And so my bar for good product manager means you can ship a product that people want. but I've seen good product managers who can send their teams in a direction that in 2 to 3 years will be obsolete.
Right.
And so if you think about teams that were building only staying on web in 2007, was it 2008? And they just refused to build mobile apps, right? Because they were stubborn about it. I've seen PMs kind of run products into the ground that way. And so I do think that it takes a certain sense of humility. And one of the concepts that comes to mind is this concept of strong opinions weakly held. I see as a pattern across great product managers because they have strong conviction in where the team is headed or the product is headed, but they're regularly gut checking it. And they're finding people that will challenge their assumptions, because the great product managers can see changes in the industry, can see changes in user behavior before anyone else on the team does. And they can either defensively make sure that they make changes to the product in advance to protect against those, or they can say, hey, like, we need to shut down this whole line of products. In the next 5 years, it's going to be obsolete. We need to shift our focus over here. And so I think that those are the best PMs I've worked with, are the ones that are able to kind of see that future by talking to really smart people and then put it in place in a way that the team feels empowered and excited, not frustrated and burnt out and like, oh man, why are you ruining what we're doing? We have a good thing going here.
Right. It seems like from what you just said and how I interpreted it, you need to be able to essentially predict the future in some manner, but also be an empiricist and like introspective of what's actually happening. And because in say a 6-month period of time, you could build something and then realize the thing that you built, because of times changed or maybe execution isn't what you envisioned it, but are you gonna go down this death march of like we gotta go there for 2 more years, or just be the bad guy and just shut it down and be like, we gotta figure this out?
That's right. And I think that like one of my favorite quotes from one of my mentors is that shipping your product is not the end, it's the beginning of the journey. Wow. And so, this is probably a common, people probably understand this by now, but I used to think that like we ship a release and then we're done and then we move on to the next one. But the reality is that like the moment you ship is the moment you start learning anything. Until your product hits real air, right? Until it's exposed to the elements, you really have no idea what's going to happen and whether you're right or not. And so I think that really finding ways to, when you ship something, make sure that you are learning actively, and that the thing you learn sets you up to learn something else and sets you up to learn something else. And so some of the greatest product managers I've worked with have almost a roadmap of what we need to learn in their head. It's not about features. It's not about solutions. It's not about problems. It's like, first, we need to ship this mobile app to see if anyone even wants mobile apps. Then we need to add this feature on, because if that works, these other people that have this problem will find our product interesting. And they almost have a map of those different things they need to learn along the way. And so those are some patterns that I see, or habits I see from really great PMs.
That's awesome. Hey, I saw this tweet today that I thought was super fascinating. The CEO of this company, and he was reflecting on things that went wrong this last year. And I built an app when I didn't need to. And I commented, and I don't know if I'll get a response. It's like, first of all, does that mean iOS native, or does that mean web app? I'm thinking it means iOS and native. The second thing is, why did you feel inclined to do that? Was that like a societal or industry pressure that like you're not looking so you have an app? Right? What are you learning from that? And that's something I find across a lot of non-technical founders is like, well, we need an app. It's like, okay, well, can we like mash together Meetup, Notion, and Stripe and the concept and literally hit
I thought that there's an example of what you're describing. There's a woman named Wes Cow, and she has a co-founder, and I'm blanking on his name. I apologize. Their company's called Maven now, but they basically launched with a Notion sign-up page. And they started to recruit. They do cohort-based courses. And so they were recruiting people, and they recruited some well-known people like Lenny Rachinsky, who's well-known in the product world. And they just had a Notion page that said, this is our company. We don't have a name yet. This is what we're doing. And people were rushing to sign up for their service that was just like, help me launch a cohort-based course. And I thought that was a great example where like they ran off that Notion spreadsheet for quite some time, as I recall, that Notion sheet. And so I think that there are definitely interesting, unique ways to put yourself out there in the world. And I do agree with you. I think that one of the most dangerous assumptions that I've made in my career is this concept of like, we have to do X. A lot of times we call these table stakes, right? So like if you're building a VR app, like you have to be able to see your hands, you have to be able to move around, you have to be able to throw and catch and like move around free. Like, no, none of that is true. There are very successful products where you can't do any of those things. And in fact, those are the ones, those people who make those tough decisions and say like, hey, we don't need that step, are usually the breakout successes in any industry. They're the ones that took the risk because they really truly understand what their customers need.
Right. Not what they think they need in extending
or what some other product provides, and they're just trying to build that product plus two more bolt-on features, for example.
What you brought up an interesting point, and this is something that I've spent the last year kind of sandboxing on. You said that these co-founders had a Notion sign-up page, and they were like, "This is how we're going to do cohort-based courses," and it took off, and now they have a company. What a lot of the times, like a tweet, you throw these ideas into the ether, and they could be the next AppSumo or like the next. I hate saying Facebook or Airbnb, but they don't get the attention that maybe the idea deserves. So there's a lot of these like platforms, indie hackers and stuff like that, where you can get exposure, but a lot of the times you just kind of feel like you're throwing stuff into the abyss.
Yeah.
What makes you think that their sign up page generated the momentum that it did? Did they already have, I'm not familiar with them, did they already have a personal brand around this subject matter? Did they get someone like Lenny to just be like, hey, we're doing this thing? You know what I mean? What do you think caused the momentum to take off?
I think that you're right. I think in their case, I don't know them that well, but my assumption from observing from the outside is a combination of having a strong personal brand. To your point, both of them had reasonably sized Twitter followers. They had run a program, I believe, for Seth Godin in the past called Alt MBA. I think they were the two that ran that. And so they had an established track record. And they were kind of widely known as experts in this space. And so, of course, when they said, hey, we need 5 people to come work with us and who want to launch a cohort-based course, people rushed to sign up. And for many people, that's not a formula you can reproduce, right? Even for me, as someone who started to try and build a following online, I'm a little late to the game, but it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of effort. And so I do think that a lot of the successes that I've seen, the takeaway for me is not so much that you put something small out there in the world and it takes off like wildfire. I actually think you brought up Airbnb. I think Airbnb have a much more believable and realistic story for those of us who are watching this at home and maybe wanting to craft something on our laptops, which is that they tried over and over again to try to get people to use this product that they had in mind, which was that you could go to a conference and you could sleep on someone's couch. From what I recall, from at least the lore of Airbnb, like they struggled with that, and it took like a breakout moment where they went to a conference and did some crazy funky marketing stunts. But my point being, like they rammed their head against this problem for quite some time before they saw traction. And so I do think that when I talked about great product managers who can kind of see the future and predict when something is a dead end, the reason it's so hard to be a great product manager is because very oftentimes everything looks like a dead end or nothing looks like a dead end. And so the best ones are able to kind of like pull out the signal from that noise and figure out when they should just keep banging their head against the wall and when they should not. I mean, I've seen a lot of people that I've worked with the problem, I think maybe 5 years ago, I would say people used to just keep trying things over and over again, and they'd stick with their idea for 5 years and it wouldn't work. And I think now maybe the problem is the opposite. The world has shifted and people are throwing away their ideas too soon. And so I think that, like, there's this
fermentation that it needs.
That's right. Yeah. And you have to, as I mentioned, once you ship something, like that's the beginning, and you have to do the hard work of really deeply understanding your customers. And I think that's the hardest balance, like the tightrope that we walk as PMs, is knowing when to keep it going, when to shut it down, when to invest more, when not to, because it's so hard to know until you're 2 to 3 years out whether you made the right decision.
Totally. How do you, and especially in Silicon Valley, like PMs, people in tech in general, don't stay around that. Like 2 to 3 years is almost, it was like some people I've seen is like 3 times the amount of time that they stay at any one job. So
yeah, that's true.
You come in, do your damage, leave, and then in 3 years, damage you did.
Yeah.
So circling back to the like product manager scope, you talked about knowing when to shut a project down, when to push forward. And a lot of that comes from like stakeholder buy-in and people that are maybe C-level or vice presidents that it seems like a sales job sometimes, right? Like you're selling, this is the way we need to go. So could you explain the relationship between a product manager and I know this changes based on size of the company. Someone at Facebook isn't in meetings with Mark Zuckerberg all the time, but like generally speaking, the relationship between a PM and a stakeholder, because it seems like when you make the decision that we're cutting this down and we're canning a project after 2 years, you better have a good reason, because you've spent arguably millions of dollars on this idea. So I'm super fascinated with how that actually works.
I think that the first thing I would say is that the person who should make a decision whether we should shut something down or not is the person who has thought through that decision the most. And in some cases, that might be like your C-level executive or your VP. In some cases, that might be you. In some cases, it might be someone else. And so I think the first challenge in dealing with stakeholders is just identifying the people who know what they're talking about and the people who deeply understand this problem. I personally, whenever I pick up a new problem space, I try to find 3 people who know 10 times more about it than I do and who just blow my mind constantly. And I talk to them and ask them questions until I'm at the point where I totally understand where they're coming from. I've almost downloaded their point of view and put it in my head. And the reason I talk to 2 or 3, and in particular, this works great with stakeholders, but it also may be, the random engineer on your team that happens to do this thing on the side for fun. You start to be able to argue their point of view. And my perspective is the moment you're ready to make that call is when you've identified all the points of view. You can just articulate all those points of view, and you can describe them. Then you can argue every single one and come up with a counter argument to every single one as if it were your own. And until you have done those steps, I don't believe you thought through the problem with enough detail or enough rigor to actually make that call. And so that's essential to my process. I'm a very social product manager, so I like to talk to people and have conversations. Some people like to go sit and just like sit in a room with a document open and just think. But the person who runs ahead and who deeply understands the audience we're building for, the product space, and comes back with a compelling argument, that is the person who should make that call. And so when I think about working with stakeholders, my job there is probably one of 2. The first is to learn from them and glean information from them. If I work with someone who works in the nonprofit space and I don't know anything about nonprofits, I'm going to try and pick their brain for as much information as possible. But my second reason I work with them is to get a bunch of information and bring it back to them to share new things they may not have thought of. And so to me, when I work with stakeholders, I always want to be in that second place where I'm talking to all the people in the company and the outside world so that I can bring back a proposal that already takes into account all of their counterpoints, already takes into account every other counterpoint that anyone could come up with. And it doesn't have to be my idea or my proposal, but I've actually stitched that all together and I can tell a very simple, compelling, logical argument for why we should go one way or the other, ideally backed with talking to people, research, and data.
Interesting. And when after that compelling story is, or you've kind of prepared your points and the stakeholder, let's say, agrees with you, then are the next steps kind of like disassembling teams and reshuffling, or that's completely out of your wheelhouse?
Oh yeah, that's totally my responsibility. No matter the size of company. And I think that I will not propose a plan to shut something down if I don't have an idea of what we should do next. And I would not propose a plan to spin up a team unless I had a clear idea of what we should do next. Right. And so for me, that's part of the diligence on the product manager side, because ultimately, like, you're responsible for the team, not just the product. And if you make decisions, you can make decisions that affect the careers of other people. You can make decisions that affect the kind of overall company direction. And so to me, I generally will have a sense of like, here's why I think we should do what we should do. Here's my recommendation. And then here's what like the 3 things we should do next look like. And I'm typically the person that goes and makes those things happen. Maybe it's spin up a new team. Maybe it's like help these people find other things to work on. Maybe it's like research these 2 new initiatives because we think they're promising. But I think that's clearly in the scope of a product manager in partnership with those other people's managers and other people on the team.
Awesome. Talking about things that kind of facilitate these decisions are metrics. Do you, as a PM, do you find metrics that are like kind of bread and butter? This is what we need to at least think about first in the past. Do you have ones that it really just depends on the product, right? Like, or stakeholders kind of putting pressure on product managers? How do you decide what metrics to optimize for? And then the next, might have a follow-up question about short and long-term cost.
I would just say up front, like, I suck at metrics. I know I'm not supposed to say that as someone who works at Facebook. It's all about data, but like, I'm the worst when it comes to data. It's taken me a lot of studying. When I to get to a place where I am somewhat confident and competent when it comes to metrics and data. And so I'm probably the wrong person to be asking this question, or maybe I'm exactly the right person.
I think you're the right person, yeah.
The way that I look at this is metrics are important for two reasons. One reason metrics are important is it allows a higher level executive to delegate responsibility. So if you and I have an agreement, we're working together, and you say, Brad, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't make revenue go down by more than 10%. Well, now we talked about that framework to bowl a strike. Well, now I know what my boundaries are. And so metrics are a way, almost like they're a way to, or a framework to abstract away that decision making. So I don't have to come back to you with every decision I make. I now know as long as I don't drop revenue or tank revenue, I can keep having my autonomy. I can keep doing the things that I want to do. And so I think that's the first purpose metrics serve from a kind of like top down perspective. And then the bottoms up perspective is metrics give us focus. So metrics allow the team to have a clear view of what we should be, the types of things we should be working on, the types of things we shouldn't. At the end of the day, they're just a proxy or a representation for an outcome we want to see in the world. And I think that for me, the reason I don't lean as heavily on metrics is because I would rather verbalize that outcome. I would rather talk to people and tell you the change I want to make in their lives. But for some people, they prefer to work with numbers. They prefer to work with data. And it's easier for them to say, I'm going to run these 7 A/B tests. I'm going to move this metric up. And if it goes up by 10%, then that's the way we should go. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that is the way I look at metrics and the two purposes I think of when I use them and wield them at work.
That answered you answered the question that I didn't know I needed to ask. So that was great. Because even from like engineering perspective, you have performance monitoring, or you can track how users use your application. But then there's all these, like, depending on who you ask, they'll argue with you like, oh, you're not using real user monitoring because you're not actually getting real user data coming back from people that use your product on a device that would actually replicate, right? Blah, 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 blah. And then you have other people that are like, that's nonsense. You need to just test in a sandbox or in a vacuum. And it's like, okay. And so you get this, I feel like, decision paralysis of I have all of these ways I can measure, and I like measuring for the sake of seeing visible improvement. But deciding on that measurement is like, you're going to piss someone off no matter what you do.
Well, I think that it comes back to what you talked about beforehand, which is learning. And so if I was in that scenario, I would try to ask the higher order question is, what do we need to learn? What are we trying to learn here? And one thing you might need to learn is our system stable in production? And that there's a number of ways to measure that and answer that question. Another thing you might be wanting to measure is, are these types of users that we're talking to doing actions we want them to take? And so I think that all of those questions and how we measure them are just a question of like, what's the higher level outcome we're trying to achieve? And then what do we need to learn to get there?
Awesome. No, that's a great point. It's like going back, it's exactly what you said, going back to what you said about like, I said, first questions or first principles, like what are we optimizing for? What do we want to learn, right? How are people using the product? Maybe we need to know that first. Maybe we don't know. Desktop, mobile, do most of the people reside in this part of the world that maybe doesn't have a solid connection? Maybe they're all in San Francisco and they're on Google Fiber like we. Yeah, that's true. And a lot of teams spend too much time trying to figure out like what their goal metric is or what their metric should be. And on the flip side, I've worked on teams that just like wing it. They don't care about their metrics. They don't log anything. And then they get stuck in production because a lot of things are broken and they don't know what's happening. And they don't even know if their product is working or not, or if it's delivering the outcome people are looking for. So I think it's like there's probably a middle ground. That's the right answer. But my suggestion to early stage PMs is, when you think about, especially people who are like just getting into it or like more junior in their career, is instead of trying to find what's the right metric, just find 2 or 3 that work for you in most situations. So for example, on most products, you want to know how many people are using it every day or every week. You want to know if there's a certain action that they're taking. Did they sign up? Did they log in? If we're building a product where you can schedule podcasts with each other, are they scheduling podcasts? And then third is probably like a counter metric that says something like, we want to make sure that the podcasts that they schedule are long enough. So if they're all scheduling podcasts and they only record one for 1 minute, that's probably a failure case. And so I think some simple set like that of like, how many people are using it? Are they doing the thing we want them to do? And when they do that thing, is it causing negative impacts to elsewhere in the ecosystem?
that's probably all you need in your first 5 years of being a PM. And the more you try and go deeper and more advanced and more like you're trying to do like retention J curves and stuff, like you probably don't need any of that crap, right? You probably just need to know, like, are people using my thing? And are they using it the way we expect them to? And then like go talk to them, talk to a bunch of people. And I think you'll probably get the answer to your question without implementing some crazy logging and Tableau dashboards.
Totally. I love that. I had a friend that this tangentially related. I think it's an interesting exercise to put the product manager hat on and try and accomplish what you just said offline. Like pick something that you, I don't know. I've heard recently that women have a hard time, or anyone that paints their nails, picking a nail color based on like skin tone at
interesting.
So it's like, yeah, I had no idea that this was a thing. So kind of having that conversation, it's like, oh, well, you could just put a Notion splash page up and be like, well, are you interested or not? But you have, like, if you live in an apartment building, you have a sample size of pretty much 1,000. Why not just print, like, do people even want to use my thing? Just like print
totally
flyers and
totally
just doors, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So kind of walking through those steps, and I've never done this before, but like offline, and it's super interesting. Like, how do you get someone to use it? How many people are using it? And does it cause negative effects, right?
And then what do they say about it? You know, if you went to, like, one of the things I like is you're describing your customer, like you're starting to describe the person you're building for. You're saying like it's a female or male who paints their nails. It's someone who, maybe lives in an urban setting. Maybe they're between this age group, and like you can find those people, right? And you can go talk to them. And oftentimes when you ask them about that problem you're describing, they may tell you that they have an entirely different problem. It's like, I know how to measure my skin tone, but then when I go online, all the images don't have someone who looks like me. So I don't really know what it looks like. And so I think that for me is the goal that I look for as a PM. Right. Like getting to that kind of like that real human problem. And I can only do that through talking to people. I can't do it from looking at dashboards.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Right. You would spend 6 months building a dashboard, pulling in data and having not talked to anyone.
Yeah, but other PMs, they do it. They'll like look at some market research and they'll be like, oh my gosh, I see this nail color question. And then I read this thing and now I cross-reference those two tables and now it's obvious we need to go build this thing. So different people have different processes.
That's really interesting. Do you, how do you measure, because when you're dealing with products and people, I don't like to reference people as resources, but from a non-emotional, just business perspective, people have salaries and they use time and they're expensive. What do you, how do you measure long and short-term costs of kind of seeing through an idea, and then what can you do to justify the cost spent? So for example, in engineering, big topic is tech debt and performance. So maybe we could talk about those things. Like your engineers are like, hey, we got to pay this tech debt down. Okay, cool. So that's going to allocate this much resources in this cycle. But then I'm expecting as a PM to see return on that with freed up velocity in X amount. Like, can you just walk me through how you think about that?
Yeah, I don't know. I have a good answer to this one. This is always challenging. How do I think about that? When we talk about looking at the cost of investments, it's not the way I view the world. So I'm the type of person who typically can do one thing and do one thing well. And so for me, the cost that I look at when we're spinning up a team, or we say like, do we want to put 3 engineers against this or 7 engineers against this, is what else could we be doing with those people? And how can we learn faster? Are there any other configurations by which we can learn faster? And so that is always like, I'm less concerned about like spending time or like wasting time, the way you describe cost. I'm more concerned about opportunity costs and what else could we be learning more quickly? Is there a different configuration that could help us learn faster? And that's pretty much the only thing that I think about when it comes to how we size our teams. An example on why I asked this question first is it's typically not good to have a very large team on an early stage problem. And I've worked at companies or worked on teams where we put 12, 13 engineers on a 0 to 1 project that has never launched. And by putting those many people on, you speed up development, but you slow down decision making. And the reality is what you actually want is a team of 2 to 3 very senior engineers who can make rapid decisions on the fly and just get the damn thing out the door, talk to customers and build it. And so for me, I'm always thinking about first, like how many people is about how fast can we learn, and what's going to set us up to learn as quickly as possible. Is that take on 2 bets at once, 3 bets at once? Is it put 2 eng on each, 3 eng on each, et cetera? And one thing that I would share that's tangentially related to what we're talking about is I don't think it's a bad thing for engineers to be idle. I know there are certain PMs who try to make sure that every single, or project managers, especially, like every single engineer needs to be 100% utilized all day long. But the reality is, like, it's okay if someone just sits around for a week. Some people would see that as a cost, but I would see it as, one, they're probably doing work that's important during that time. And 2, it may be that like certain people need to keep making progress on other projects. And so when I look at teams, I first think, as I mentioned, like how can we learn as quickly as possible? So how many people do we devote? And then when it comes to tech debt and paying that down in architecture, I think this comes down to trust. And I think it's a very hard, I don't have a rubric or a framework for this, but I can tell you that more often than not, when we have done a big like refactor the whole system or redo a totally new architecture, usually we want to do the same thing a year later. And so I haven't seen those work out often. And second, I also, on the flip side, when an engineer comes and says, like, we need to pay this tech debt off now, I am always wrong when I tell them not to do that.
Interesting.
I don't think I've ever in my career been like, no, you're wrong. And so so I think it's a negotiation. But I think that the way that I specifically approach tech debt is I try to talk through the outcomes that will be enabled in the time frame we think. And so if we're going to do this refactor, we're going to do this re-architecture, like what do we get from it? And then in what time frame? And if in 6 years we can now support 200 billion users using our product, but we don't even have 10, then maybe now is not the right time to do it. But if this enables us to onboard an extra 500 users next year, and that's the biggest bottleneck to being successful, then we should absolutely pay that price now as opposed to waiting. And so I don't think I have a direct answer to your question.
No. That's I really like where you went with that, with the opportunity cost, and you brought up a lot of really interesting points I didn't even think about. When I wouldn't say I'm idle, if ever, but when I have more time to, air quotes, play, you see more things in the application outside of your kind of like your focus point that you can then be like, oh wow, like I didn't realize that's maybe a user friction point that like I can actually fix because I have some time, or maybe I noticed that there's this performance improvement that I can make that has been around for a while. Maybe best practice wise, we should do it. Maybe we shouldn't, depending on use cases. So I think you have like a wider lens and you get the chance to kind of pull at strings that maybe need to be pulled on.
It also might be like helpful to just like take a break, and I think that we're constantly trying to like push people to work harder and to ship more and to ship faster. But oftentimes we end up in these cycles where people are so burnt out on the regular and they just get into this constant state of burnout that I found personally that like if an engineering manager comes up and says like, hey, like this person doesn't have any work for 2 weeks, they're going to be frustrated. Sometimes I think that's a good thing. Maybe they need that 2-week break. Maybe that's actually going to help their mental health. And then they come back and hit the ground running. And so for me, I'm not the person that lays everything out on a Gantt chart and tries to make sure that all the lines line up. Yeah. I'm okay with some gaps in there for the reason you mentioned, but also just like, I think it's good for us as humans.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And usually you get the time off after you've already burnt out, right?
Yes, exactly.
And I need time off now. And then you take weeks and you're like, I don't want to go back to work.
Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. And another thing I wanted to touch on, because you had a really solid product management perspective on tech debt. And oftentimes I don't think about it from that perspective. I'm just mainly like engineering. And you said, okay, what is this tech debt going to do for us? And what are we optimizing for? And I think tech debt is a really dangerous term because it encompasses too many different things, kind of like product management, right? There are system design refactors that virtually give you nothing but improve developer experience. There are things you can do to improve patterns that also don't give you anything in return
Mm-hmm.
from a user.
You're thinking user-facing perspective, but I do think there's internal benefits.
Yeah. And you know, like in some cases, you might not get any even developer benefits, but just because best practices state you should do X, Y, and Z because of A, B, and C,
I think like test coverage is a great example, right?
Totally.
Like, or even like integration unit tests and spending the time to build out your framework and do that right. In theory, doesn't buy you anything until your site doesn't crash or go down.
Exactly. And then how can you quantify time down?
Yes. Yeah.
Actually, in the last podcast I did, talked with one of my ex coworkers from GitLab, and he was a QA engineer, and now he does courses on integration testing and unit testing.
Interesting.
The whole stack. And we went into your startup founder. You don't have the resources to spend testing for testing's sake. How do you get 80-20%?
Yeah, I like that.
So I'll link you. It was really interesting. But and then there are bugs that, let's say maintainability, that are doubling time for every subsequent feature build. The problem is when you're on a larger engineering team touching a bunch of different things, you aren't going to feel that pain because you're going to get moved on to something else until you come back. So it's like pay now, pay later. But again, user facing, nothing's changed, right? We're assuming we're in an application that's pretty stable. All the flows are pretty much there. But then in 6 months, you go, hey, Scott, I need you to build this thing. Oh, well, it's coupled. Now I need to pull this apart. I can make the argument either way. Is it worth it? I mean, I could spend how many more times am I going to have to touch this feature? Are we going to completely redo this feature? Is it right? Like, it gets crazy.
I think that's why it comes down to trust. 100%. And ultimately, like, I have to trust your intuition as an engineer. And if I hear something that sounds crazy and my spider sense picks up, if you're like, you know what, I'm going to do this, and to decouple these two is going to take me 1.5 years, and we can't ship anything on the website or the app for 1.5 years, and development is stalled for the whole company, then I'd be like, well, are you sure? Can we maybe get a second opinion on this? But if it's within reason, then I think, like, I trust you as the expert to make those trade-offs.
I also think engineers need to be better, me, myself included, on what is paying this down getting us?
Yeah.
You brought up testing. That's a huge one. A lot of times I feel like engineers in general test for testing's sake, not for optimal user flow catching production errors sake.
Yeah.
Right. And so, because then when you do a refactor and you have all these unit tests that are like super low level, everything breaks, but your user flow hasn't changed. So now you're spending a week fixing these tests that aren't giving you any more business value. So I think that's a good thing to like work on.
And it's a good conversation to have, right? Like,
totally.
Even if you can say, like, this is the benefit, and the benefit is like next, because our engineers roll off every 6 months, the next one that comes on ramps up twice as fast. Like, oh, that's okay. That's an interesting trade-off to discuss, trading off against some other user-facing feature. Like, I would love to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Because it may be that's way more important to us in the long run.
100%. I'm going to stop ranting after this one more point. I think the same thing happens with framework technology decision making. Like GraphQL's huge and popular, and GraphQL's great. Like, I have nothing against it, but when you're doing an overhaul, what is it getting you? Like, I think that needs to be really clear before you're like, allocate all of these resources to implementing this thing. And a lot of times I feel like people want to do it just because it's the new thing.
Yeah.
It sounds cool. And you have conference, you're right. Like, I'm not trying to be an asshole, but it's like, you got conferences, it's popular, it's shiny. It
definitely happens. Dude, it happens to me on my side projects all the time.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, Next.js, I got to try that. Yeah. All the cool kids are using it, right? I'm in there.
Right. But like, you could have done the same thing with HTML.
jQuery. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, do I need Next.js for a sign-up page? Probably not.
Right. Yeah.
So, and okay, we're gonna get into some good questions. All the questions have been like, this conversation has been awesome. What's the worst thing an engineer can say to you as a PM, or like things that you've gotten in the past that you're like, this just hurts our relationship. This isn't even productive. Like obvious and non-obvious as well.
I think that the most offensive thing someone, whether engineer or not, can say to me is if we run user research and I bring back a bunch of quotes from actual people say like, I don't care about what that person had to say. They're wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. And I hit a lot because an example might be like if you're working on a pretty forward-facing, trendy tech product, there are people all over Reddit that will bring their opinion about your product. And it's easy to say like, we don't listen to people on Reddit. They're just like tech early adopters. That's not our customer. But the reality is like they have a real point and they have a real point of view. And they may not be our customer. We should at least hear and understand what they have to say. So that's one thing that frustrates me. And then I think that the second area for me that that really gets under my skin is when someone looks to me and tells me, I can't make that decision, it's your decision. And they're looking for me to make a decision. And the reason that bothers me as a pet peeve of mine is my job as the PM is not actually to make calls. I can do it, but in many cases, I am not the right person to do it. And so I will make a decision, but I would rather you come to me with a point of view if you're on the team. If you're a front-end engineer working on a product that we're working on, like I would hope that you have thought about what we're building, why we're building it, who we're building it for, why this is the right feature. And I'd love to hear what you think first before you ask for my take. And so that's just personally like a preference, the type of person that I like to work with. But I like to work with people who are thoughtful about the problems we're solving, the products we're shipping, and the features that we're developing, because I find that over time, I can delegate a lot of decision-making to that person and let them run. And I would rather work with whether it be engineers or designers, people who want that kind of freedom and want to be able to kind of like form their opinion. And I will help you craft that opinion and shape it and like get alignment from leadership, from the CEO, et cetera. But I want you to take the initiative to think through the problem and to say like, I think this is the right decision and here's why. And so to me, that's just a preference for the type of people I like to work with. I don't like to work with people who just kind of like come like, what's my ticket? What's my task? Okay, it's done. What's the next one?
Right. Interesting. Yeah, something that I'll share now. It's like when and I don't expect everyone to be non-technical. That's not but when someone says, "Can't you just build it?" Like, can you just? It's like,
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, you can like go for it.
Yep. Yeah. Totally. Like press the make app button. It pops it out.
And then your wish is my command.
I will say on the flip side, one thing that I've done that is one of the biggest mistakes in my career as a PM talking to an engineer is so I code a lot on the side. I don't know if we've talked about this. We talked about this a little bit. Like I used to spend a lot of time on side projects and writing apps and programs. And at one of my companies, they were talking about whether or not to use a front-end JavaScript framework. And this was probably 8 years ago. And the decision was don't use JavaScript framework, put it all in line. And they had made a couple other decisions that at the time for the team made sense. But me having thought, what are you guys crazy? You're not gonna use any frame, you're not gonna structure your JavaScript at all. So we just have all these files laying around and no one knows where everything is. And I got this look, like literally like the look of death. Like they just like glared at me like, what, like back the fuck off, man. Excuse my language. Like this is not your area. So I've learned over time that rather than coming and having a really deeply technical discussion with the engineering team, which I'm totally not qualified to have, that instead I take more of like I call it like the Daenerys Targaryen approach. If you've seen Game of Thrones, where like she's like a 12-year-old girl. She walks in the room with a bunch of, she does like, he has an army and all these like veteran army warlords are like, we're going to attack. We're going to go in through the front. She's like, look guys, I'm just a 12-year-old girl. I don't know what I'm talking. Are you sure we should go through the front? So that's the way I approach things when I talk especially when there are areas way out of my element. It's like, if something sounds totally crazy, I'll ask a question about it, but I will not tell them what the right solution is from my perspective and assume that I know all these things that I've taken them into account, because the reality is they know way more than me.
That's interesting. But the case about your example, the like 8 years ago when framework or not to framework, it's like, but you were speaking from a empirical like experience perspective, you know. It's not just like I read the Tiger News article, you know.
Yes, that's true.
Like,
that's true.
And bringing it back to your Reddit customer conversation,
Uh-huh.
like the point of view matters, right? Like,
Yeah.
and if you're an engineer and confident in like your ability, then you should be able to have the point and the counterpoint
That's true.
and be
That's
able
true.
to have the discussion instead of just being like staring you out of the room, which like
Yeah, but to be fair, like if someone came in and asked me, why are you using this framework to present this deck to this person? And like I can see why I'd be like, why do you even care about that? So I can see both sides of it. For me personally, like I like teams where everyone has some level of generalist expertise. And it's like that's just the way I like to work. Like I love when like my engineers and my designers kind of like nerd out on like what's the right user experience solution here. And then like when me and the engineer can sit down and talk through like high level technical solutions. But that's just my personal preference.
Awesome. I want to be mindful of your time. I could talk to you all day.
Sure.
But yeah, thank you so much for having this discussion. I wanted to make sure that if you didn't have any questions for me or we can talk about anything, and then I want to give you some time to plug your blog and some of the other stuff you're working on if you have anything.
Yeah, let me look at our agenda real quick. Let me see if I forgot anything, if there's anything I thought was interesting.
I think we covered most of it. I didn't ask a couple of questions because I was like, oh, well.
I think the what uniques. Okay, so I do have something I'd like to talk about.
Let's do it.
And I'll just throw out a concept out there. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes.
One thing that I have learned over time. Remember, I mentioned there were PMs that were more data PMs and PMs that were more user research focused PMs. There's a wide spectrum of types of PMs out there. And so I'll share a couple kind of like archetypes that I've seen recently. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. There are PMs who are strong on what I'll call like strategy and vision. And so this is more where I fall, where like I like to spend time talking about the high level, where are we going, like what does success look like, talk to a bunch of customers, shape it out, work with designers and try and figure out like put a prototype together and get it out there. There are also PMs who are way more comfortable looking at the day-to-day execution of the team. Like working on a growth team, for example, like what are the next 3 projects? What does a spreadsheet of tasks look like? Which one's on track? Which one's not? And so those are kind of more what I'll call like execution PMs. And then there's PMs that like to just go around like convince everyone what we should do. And those are kind of like they like to align. They like to work with leadership, work big across companies, et cetera, work with biz dev and partnerships to get companies involved. So that's like an example of a spectrum of PMs I have observed. And I'm wondering, have you seen other spectrums out there? Because you've probably worked with a few that like might exist. Like what are the other kind of like archetypes or continuums that exist among PMs?
I've worked with strategy one.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked with the last one, the aligning business. I don't work with them closely, but I've seen those. The only other one that I might be able, I'm kind of going more, I've seen more that are, they bring a specific expertise to the space.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe they started a company, ran a company, and then exited, and then they're bringing like this niche industry expertise.
Like subject matter expert.
Yeah, but not necessarily like within the product, but like how to run. I guess it wouldn't be growth, but it would be like growth. It's like I've met I have a couple product managers that I've had the ability to work with who are like obsessed with like queuing theory and unblocking and process.
Yeah, totally. I think those are more the execution people, like product flow and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
So I guess you would call that execution, and how that not only like how that affects our team, but how that affects the organization.
Yes. Yeah.
But then you have the product managers that are like ex-engineers, and then they use their expertise and kind of float. Like, it's like a fill-in, like, maybe they'll work with you and they're highly technical in this one space, and then you'll be able to like feed off of each other to then help each other make decisions quicker, because then you don't need to back and forth across other teams.
Yeah,
those are the other ones that you did a really good job summing them up, but that's all I can think about.
So the reason I wanted to bring this up is I think that for me, when I talk to people, one of the questions I get a lot is, how should I work with a product manager? I'm an engineer, I'm a user researcher, I'm a data scientist, et cetera. And the reason I think it's important to point out that there's a lot of different types is that my recommendation is that you should identify or ask what your product manager's strengths are, what their weaknesses are. So for me, I'm like stronger on the product sense and kind of like strategy, and I'm stronger on the aligning people and weaker on execution. What that means is, if you can come in and do some of that execution project level work for me, you are my best friend instantly. And so I think like some product managers think they need to do everything, but the best ones I've seen will find the areas that are their gaps and find other people on the team to help fill those gaps. So if there's something you're passionate about that your PM sucks at, like, don't be afraid to have that conversation, because the PM as a job, at least most of the PMs I work with, happily will delegate big parts of their job so they can take on more of the thing they love to do. Just like if you love writing code and someone else said, I will write all your tests for you, be like, whoa, oh, okay, all right, let's chat, man. If that's the thing you like, and you know what I mean? So like, I would encourage, whoever is listening to this, if you're going to work with a PM, like, figure out what they're good at, figure out what they like to do. The intersection of those two things I'll call a strength. And then if they're stuck and they can't give you ideas, give those 3 examples I gave or some of the examples you gave, and then see if you can politely pick up some of that work. For me, I love when engineers will run a team meeting. I don't like running team meetings. I love when they will keep track of the like week by week progress we're making, because I don't like to do that. And I'm not good at it. So for me, I'm like a kid thrashing in a pool doing those things, where someone who's strong on the execution, has that muscle, can just do it in 10 seconds of their time, which then frees me up to spend more time thinking about the long term of where we're going. And so don't be afraid to assume that the PM is going to do PM stuff, because the reality is they're probably happier if you do it anyway.
Right. That's a great point. Have you read oh yeah, did you read Peter Drucker's book?
I read through I forget the one. It's a yellow book, but yeah, I read through it once you sent it. You mentioned it to me.
The Effective Executive.
Yeah, that's it. Yep.
Did you read Managing Oneself?
No, I read Effective Executive. Yeah.
So this kind of goes back. I'm not sure if Peter Drucker talks about, I can't remember if he talks about this, but it's like knowing what your strengths are and playing to them, right? This is to me, it sounds like this is an example of being intrinsic and being like, these are the things I'm good at and I want to do. And then let's see if we can like align on the things that I'm not good at, that you're good at, that you pick up. Right. Yeah.
And I purposely like look for those when I join a team or I'm starting a company or whatever, like I find people with those skill sets. I'll be very explicit and say like, hey, like I need someone who is strong in execution to complement me, because otherwise we're going to be in trouble.
Right. A lot of strategy.
Yep, that's right. That's right. And nothing gets done.
Awesome. Where can people find you, and like your blog? You have an email list, anything else you're working on?
Yeah, so primarily you can find me on, it's at bdickason.com, bdickason.com, like my last name. That is where I write. I typically was writing on a weekly cadence. I've paused that and tried to do a more longer term think pieces. And I was just talking early at the beginning of the session, whether that would be a great idea or a terrible idea. So either way, next Friday morning, which is this following Friday, the second Friday in July, there will be a new blog post up. It will be sent out. So I send out my newsletter every Friday morning at 6 a.m. Pacific. I don't know why I chose that time. And then those get posted on my blog at the same time. So check it out. And you can also find me on Twitter at bdickason.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining. Hopefully we get to have a talk like this again soon.
Yeah, this is awesome. Thank you for having me. This is fun.
Awesome. Thank you. See ya.
See ya.